Welcome to the Dear Dyslexic Podcast, where lived experience meets real conversation. We shine a light on the stories that need to be heard, with honest and inspiring conversations with people with dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and autism. The Dear Dyslexic Podcast is more than just a show. It's a community, a space for connection, and a movement to rethink dyslexia. Subscribe today and join us on our journey, one story at a time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dear Dyslexic Podcast show. I'm very excited to have Michael with us today. We've had lots and lots of tech issues. He's been very patient, and then when we started recording, I accidentally kicked him off. So we're having a funny start to our session today.
I didn't take it personally.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad. Welcome to the craziness that is the Dear Dyslexic Podcast. Michael and I met through another podcast, which is actually Michael's podcast called Dyscastia. Did I just say that right?
Yeah, beautiful.
Great. Awesome. And we have been talking about supporting young people and adults with dyslexia, but Michael does a lot of work tutoring children and young people that have dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. So today's whole episode is going to be talking about those three learning difficulties because we know there's not enough conversations around it.
Yeah, well, I think it depends on the purpose of the label. So I think disability is the label to use when you're talking about funding and support and NDIS and things that are official, because I think that's something everybody understands and it has a certain gravity to it, but I'm not sure that is a label that everyone's comfortable with, personally. I like the term difficulty because for me that's just logical because it's difficult. I find reading and writing and kids that live with these learning difficulties find it difficult. I don't generally use the term difference because I think it implies that you've got to do something different or that they learn differently, but they don't learn differently. Everybody learns in the same way. It's just that they probably need things broken down into smaller chunks and a lot more practice and exposures, but it's not an actual difference. You know what I mean? That's why I'm comfortable with difficulty or disability.
I'd love to circle back to the difference and doing things differently, which is actually part of our whole name of our business. But it's interesting what you say about we don't learn differently. But before I sidetrack us again, could you just share a little bit about yourself, Michael, and the work that you do?
Yes, so I work as an intervention tutor. So mostly with kids living with dyslexia or dyscalculia, some kids living with both, but also some kids living with ADHD and autism and mixtures of all of those. Often those neurodivergents kind of sit together. Ultimately, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to me, because I just look at the kid that's in front of me and think, what do they need? Yeah, so day to day, that's what I do, tutoring kids. And I also have created a whole bunch of resources and software for teaching morphology. So morphology is a big part of English and literacy intervention. So I've built word cracking software, which is morphology software. And we have a program on word cracking called the Literacy Support Kit, which I did with someone called Sally Andrew, and that's designed for students who struggle a lot with literacy. So there are some common literacy intervention programs that are out there, lots of them, and they're really good. But for some kids, even those intervention programs are too difficult and they go too fast. The one that I generally use is called Playberry, and it's a fantastic program. But by the time you get to teaching point 10, it starts getting too complicated for some kids, particularly if kids live with dysgraphia and handwriting's difficult. And so we've designed a whole bunch of resources that let kids progress and keep moving forward, but in a much more simplified format. So they can still get that success and confidence and, move forward without feeling like, now intervention's too hard, and that has, a whole other connotations. Apart from that, I live with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dysgraphia. So I have lived experience of that, which, makes tutoring harder in some ways. But, I think in some ways it's good because I can kind of empathize with where the kids are at. Because I kind of think if I can understand it, well, they can probably understand it. And I'm married. I have 2 kids. Both live with dyslexia. My daughter lives with dyscalculia. There you go. That was a big mouthful.
No, that was great because I knew you created a program, but I was just in the wrong area. It was literacy, not numeracy.
Yeah.
So, how did you end up? Did you train as a teacher originally, or how did you end up tutoring? What was it?
So I started out as a teacher, but it was secondary physical education, drama and science. So a long way away from dyslexia or literacy, deliberately, because I avoided them like the plague. And so I taught for a while, but most of my time was spent working in theatre in my early years. And then I started working in multimedia, I suppose you could call it. So lots of 3D animation, video, designing exhibitions for museums and science centres. And then I worked in the zoo and then the environment department. And then I worked in the disability sector as a marketing manager. So I've done lots of different things. And then I had kids, and my first child was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I remember the psychologist was kind of introducing us to the diagnosis and saying, this is what it means. And my wife started to laugh, and the psychologist said, what's so funny? And she said, well, you're describing my husband, not my son. And I was like, what? Really? I don't live with dyslexia, do I? And so, like many people, my kind of, initial diagnosis started with my kids being diagnosed. And then my daughter was diagnosed later with dyscalculia, which is difficulty with maths. And I'd never heard of it. And we were trying to find a tutor for her and just couldn't find one. There was just nobody, not even at Spelled or any of the usual places you would look. And so, I wasn't bad at maths, and I was trained as a teacher. And so I thought, well, I'll tutor her in maths. How hard can it be? I don't think I did a brilliant job in those early days. But that got me really interested. And then eventually I got formal training, when I decided, okay, I'm going to make this my job, which was, I think, about 6 years ago now. I quit my full-time job. I was actually made redundant, and so it kind of forced my hand, and then started tutoring, and I haven't looked back since. Yeah, so a strange journey.
Well, I find that a lot of dyslexics have a similar kind of roadmap with employment. They can end up doing lots of different things throughout their career.
And I have always found it difficult to be in a job for a long time. I think the longest time I was in a job was 5 years. And so tutoring now is my longest time, even though I'm self-employed. I've made it past the 5-year mark.
I'd love to go back to when you said you started tutoring your daughter in maths, because dyscalculia is so much more than just maths in a lot of ways that people don't understand. Are you able to unpack a little bit around some of the, because I guess, some people might think that some people often assume with dyslexia, the letters just move on the page or things like that. Are there common myths that you've heard around dyscalculia as well? Your assumptions?
I'm not sure. I actually think one of the issues with dyscalculia is that, like me, when I first heard of it, people have never heard of it. I think one of the issues is there's very little awareness of it. And even maths teachers that I've spoken to, hugely competent maths teachers, don't really have a huge, much of anything other than a basic understanding of it. And so I don't think that there's a lot of myths out there like there is about dyslexia. It's more that it's invisible and, it's misunderstood. well, I don't even think it gets to the chance to be misunderstood because it's just like a real lack of awareness of it. Certainly my experience with my daughter is that no one had ever heard of it. And so whenever she had a new teacher, it was always the whole, here we go, introducing a new teacher to it again. So I'm not sure that there are that many myths around it. I think that there are a lot of reasons for it. So maths is really difficult for a lot of people. So a lot of people living with dyslexia find maths difficult. And a lot of people with learning difficulties find maths difficult because it relies so much on working memory and processing speed. And so, I've tutored students that don't have any kind of formal identification, but they have slow processing speed or a limited working memory. And so they probably wouldn't meet the criteria for dyscalculia, but maths is extremely difficult if you can't keep all those kind of digits in your head and do those calculations. So I think pure dyscalculia, if we're talking about dyscalculia, is a little bit different to that, in that, I work with kids that find maths difficult, and, you live with dyslexia, you find maths difficult because a lot of the language is difficult. But really with dyscalculia, it's a lack of basic number sense. It's like if you think about dyslexia and think, at the core of most dyslexia is like phonological difficulty, difficulty hearing those little sounds in words and being able to break them apart and work with them. Dyscalculia is like that, but with a sense for numbers. It's like you can't hear the sounds in dyslexia. You can't see the numerosity in things. You know what I mean? You just don't have an idea of bigger and smaller or how that works. So, for example, I would have a typical discussion with somebody living with dyscalculia, and it might be like, okay, what's 12 plus 2? And they'll go, 122. Because you add another 2 on and now it's 122. And you go, no, not quite. So I get out 12 counters and I'll add 2 more counters and I'll count out 13, 14. And I'll go, so 12 plus 2 is 14. What's 12 plus 2? 6. It's like, the concept just doesn't exist for them, if they've never had any kind of remediation. So, it's a clumsy example, but it's like a real disconnect with numbers that I find with kids living with dyscalculia. Difficulty with picturing a number line in their head, thinking, is 10 bigger than 15 or smaller than 15? So those kind of really fundamental conceptual things they find difficult. And so you can imagine that if you don't have that number sense, then when you get to more difficult maths, that really conceptual stuff where you're just seeing digits, numbers on a page, it doesn't quite make sense. Just yesterday, I was working with a kid, that I've been with for a while, and we've talked about equals and what equals means. And, I wrote 4 equals 3 plus 1. And I was saying, is that true? And he was saying, no, it's not. Because he knows that equals means the same, but he was saying, but it's a 4 on this side, and it's a 3 and a 1 on... Did I say 3 plus 2? It's a 3 and a 1 on this side.
I had to think then.
That's working memory. It's a 3 and a 1 on this side. See, and so he knew equals means the same, but he just didn't have a concept of value. That 4 represents 4 things and 3 represents 3 things and 1 thing. And so then when I put the counters out, he was going, oh, right, really? Like he was surprised. And so, yes, it's that real lack of making that number sense connection that I find with kids living with dyscalculia, rather than kind of maths anxiety or working memory issues. You see a lot of people living with dyslexia or working memory issues, or ADHD and executive function, following sequences and things like that are difficult. And there's a lot of that in maths, so that can make maths difficult. But dyscalculia is more of that, really difficult grasping of those fundamental concepts of bigger and smaller, and what 3 means. What is 3? What does it mean? A 3-ness of something, or a 5? What does 5 actually mean? They find that difficult to grasp.
And so what about understanding the concept of time, like what the actual time is? And because when we talk about dyscalculia from some of the podcasts I've listened to, and there's that real struggle of understanding concept of time as well, which means then someone can possibly be late for something. Like, how do you see it impacting outside of just trying to understand those basic, what 3 things plus 4 things means?
Time is a big one. That lack of a sense of time, and I'm not speaking scientifically here, just my experience and opinion, but I think they're related. I think, the idea of quantity and bigger and smaller, because time is, after all, just a measurement, isn't it? And so the idea of more time, less time is still that same kind of circuitry, isn't it? Of what's more and what's less. I know that, with my daughter, for example, you'd go to a room and you'd say, okay, we're leaving for school in 10 minutes. Put your shoes on. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And we got to go. And, I go to the kitchen, I come back, and she's like got a movie on, and she's put dress up on, and she's dancing and having a little disco. And I was saying, oh, we're going to be late. And she was going, what? I thought I had plenty of time. Like, just zero concept of what 5 minutes meant. And so one of the things we used to do is talk in terms of more concrete things. And so we would say, I remember there's a show called Charlie and Lola that the kids watched, and they had fairly short, I think they were like, 5-minute episodes or something. And so we would say it's like 2 Charlie and Lola episodes. And so she had more of a concept of that, of like, okay, I have a feel for how much that is. And so for us, more kind of concrete things like that to link time to worked, rather than kind of that conceptual 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That's very difficult to comprehend it. And the other thing we had with her was, with both my kids, was like a morning routine in a little book, which later became like a big fun PowerPoint thing where they would just go page by page and, when this one was done, do the next task. But the problem again was time. And so not knowing how long to spend on those tasks. So I made a PowerPoint that had each task with a little visual timer on it. So they could see, by the time this gets to here, I need to have done this. And then it flicks over to the next one, and, plays a little alarm if you're going over time. So kind of external supports like that around time were really useful when they were young. But I think that goes to show, doesn't it, that, as you say, that lack of time, I think, again, this is just my theory, but I think that is around time being a measurement and difficulty understanding quantity, what's bigger, what's smaller. Yeah, so it has big impacts. There's a lot of maths in everyday life that you don't think of. And, what's particularly difficult for people is often fractions are very difficult. And fractions are everywhere, aren't they? You talk about reading a clock, that's all fractions, isn't it? Half past, quarter past, or recipes. So there's a lot of maths in everything. And so when you live with dyscalculia and have kind of no concept of it, it's really difficult. And as you say, it goes beyond just 2 + 3 is 5. It has, day-to-day implications and impacts.
So what are some of those that you've seen, like for your daughter or younger people, like younger as in teenagers that you've worked with, that flow-on effect for them trying to manage school, or if they're starting like part-time work? Because even now, like we're not seeing cash as often anymore. It's all tap and go. I guess maybe that's a good thing for people with dyscalculia. I don't know. But, when that flow-on effect, as you start to transition into becoming a young adult, what do you tend to see as some of the tripping hazards for young people as well that you work with?
Yeah. I think money is a big one. Money and percentages and discounts, because they are throughout everything, aren't they? You know,
Yes.
when you're shopping, how do you know? How do you know value? Because we know that shops try and trick us, don't they?
Mm.
They make something cheaper, but it's in a smaller package. And so being able to work out what's the best value is quite tricky and a really good life skill. Even things, you know, as you're getting older, like loans and credit cards and what interests mean, they can have lifelong impacts, can't they? If you don't understand those basics of finances. And it would be very easy to take advantage of people that don't understand that. I mean, in regards to money, I think it's I don't want to say a bad thing, but I think it makes it harder not having cash, because I find, I do work with kids with money, and I've got a whole lot of real money and some play money, and most of them kind of react like they have not seen money before. Like they just don't really deal with it. And I think part of the work that I do with kids living with dyscalculia that works best is to make things concrete for them. So it's very difficult just to have abstract maths concepts and not tie them to anything in the real world. And so if money is only ever kind of digits and doodles on a page, it doesn't have any real meaning. And so having coins and notes and doing a lot of work, we play shops, and, I teach them the shopkeeper's method of working out change. And, so I give them a whole lot of products, and I come in and I buy stuff, and we practice that. And it's actually really difficult for them. And so having practical methods and practice, lots and lots of practice and repetition to do those things I think it's a vital step to actually work with the physical objects and see how it works, rather than it just all be electronic. Because it's so easy to spend money, make a mistake because you thought you were spending $27, but really it was $270.
Yes, as a dyslexic,
that's
it's very easy to do.
yeah, that's right. And so I think having those skills are important. I think money and fractions, a lot of that is to do with the concept of value, which I think people living with dyscalculia find particularly difficult. So when I'm working with kids and adults, I talk about what we use numbers for. So I start with, what are numbers? I mean, have you ever thought about it? What are they?
Are there an arbitrary concept like how we just randomly called a cup a cup?
Yeah, but do they exist? Like, you don't go for a walk in the forest and see numbers. And so, like, what are they? And so, like, I literally start from there, because I think you really have to build up your understanding of numbers and what they are to get that number sense. And I think if you think about it, in terms of dyslexia, which is more familiar, there are many people that would learn to read without really being taught. You know what I mean? You can just kind of pick it up because you get enough exposure, and, those lucky people, it's about 30% of people can learn to read just because it comes easily for them. But then if you live with dyslexia or dysgraphia, you have to be explicitly taught how it works, because your brain doesn't pick up on those patterns naturally. And so you have to go very fine-grained, explicit instruction on, here's how language works, here's how you spell, here's how you write, and break it right down into those fine points. And the reason why reading and spelling is so difficult is when you live with dyslexia or dysgraphia, you're always having to consciously do that while you're reading or spelling. You can't kind of let your subconscious look after it and think about what think more of the story you're writing and just let your hand do the writing. You've got to stop and think, how do I spell this, which kind of interrupts. So if you think about that in terms of maths and numbers, you really have to build up explicitly this understanding of what numbers are, what we use them for, and the fact that, for example, we use numbers for 4 things. And that's a little bit confusing for kids because we usually just talk about numbers in terms of counting, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you think that's numbers. But we use numbers for counting, for measuring things. And so, but that's different to counting, isn't it? So you can have one thing that's 12 centimeters and one thing that's 24 centimeters. That's not really counting, that's measuring or measuring time. So that's a whole new concept, isn't it? That's different to counting. Count, measurement, value is really tricky with numbers because we say something has value and we use numbers to assign value. So in that case, we're not counting anything, we're not measuring anything, we're just arbitrarily saying that that coin is worth 2 and this one's worth 5. It has nothing to do with how much it weighs or how many you've got. So that's a whole other way to think about numbers. And then we use numbers for position to define the position of things. That's how GPS works. That's how graphs and everything work. So I kind of break it down very explicitly like that. And we look at those individual things that we use numbers for, because I think if you're not explicitly shown this very complex system, then you can see how it is very difficult to understand, isn't it? And particularly in terms of value, because our whole number system is based on value. Because we have 10 digits, like digit 1, digit 2, and this digit 1 could be worth 1, or it could be worth 10, or it could be worth 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000, depending on where it is. See, this is so confusing. No, this is very complicated, isn't it? And so if you're someone that doesn't just intuitively understand that whole system of numbers and how it works, then you really need to be kind of walked through that explicit story and scaffolding all along the way. So just, it might take kids years, to start coming to terms with these concepts, and a lot of physical manipulation of things. And so I think that kids living with dyscalculia really need to see physical representation of things before we look at pictures of things or text descriptions. Count, measure, value, position. And so I think breaking things down explicitly like that is really important, because you can't expect a kid who doesn't have a concept of numbers to be able to go from counting to understanding value of something, or measurements, or volume and capacity. It's also complicated conceptually if you don't have just that natural ability to understand it. And so, yeah, it's a matter of, working slowly, carefully, explicitly, building one concept onto the next, and getting that feeling of success, and really making sure that they understand things from a physical perspective before you try and make it conceptual or like a word problem or something like that. So
yes, and as you were talking, even though I don't have dyscalculia, I really struggle with maths. And I just kept thinking, I wish I'd had you as a tutor when I was younger, because I had lots of maths tutors. And I remember in year 7, the maths teacher, she'd get everyone set up in class and then she'd spend the whole session with me. And I was really lucky that she did that, because once you brought in the fractions and the language and where the decimal place goes, I'm completely lost. So I was thinking this that whole time. If only someone had explained it like that to me, maybe I would have grasped it, because you need that, I think, even as a dyslexic to then help you conceptualize. So then when you start to bring in the language, which makes it even more complicated, you have that foundations, because once you get older, financial literacy, you're not set up properly.
Yeah, that's right. And money's really hard. Rounding money, rounding coins is difficult. Understanding the value of a dollar compared to a cent. It's 100 times more, but it doesn't feel like that. 30 cents doesn't feel that different to $3 if you're just looking at it as numbers. It's just an extra zero, isn't it? And so that doesn't give you a sense of how much bigger it is. Um, and so, yeah, I think getting that really hands-on sense of numbers. I do lots of estimation because that's a skill you need.
It
And
is.
anxiety comes into it too, doesn't it? Because if you know that you struggle with maths, even if it's not dyscalculia, it's that anxiety. And as soon as you're anxious, your working memory goes out the window and you can't think straight. And so, when you mention contracts and things to sign, that's one of my difficulties as well. Filling in forms. As soon as that happens, my head just goes like I'm a space cadet. Like I just can't think straight. And it really takes a lot of effort to kind of calm myself down and think, okay, let's just take this one little piece at a time. And I think if you think of that, for adults as well as kids in the classroom, if you're in that state of mind, maths is probably the hardest thing to do, isn't it? Because it relies so much on that working memory and being able to translate those kind of conceptual things into a physical reality.
And I think, how do you work with your students? Because I think if we've always struggled with maths, like I say, oh, I'm so bad with money. And so I'm really trying hard this year in particular as the business grows that I can't. Well, one, you just can't be bad with money as an adult because it creates a lot of risk for us. But it's around how can we change our mindset from a young age to help children say, okay, you might be struggling, but doesn't mean you're going to be bad at this for your whole life, or you're going to have really good strategies to help you so you don't have this negative self-concept around money and numbers. And like, are there things that we can do from a young age to help us not feel like, because then it's kind of ingrained, isn't it? I'm always bad with money. I'm never going to be able to manage a budget. I'm always going to order extra food and that's just life.
Yeah.
Like, what can we do to help that?
Well, I think that kind of thinking is protective, isn't it? Because it comes from years of making mistakes. And so if you've gone to school and you just don't get it, despite, everyone's best efforts, then you kind of default to that state of, I'm never going to get it. And it sounds empty, I think, to try and override that by just saying, oh, it'll be okay. You know what I mean? It'll be okay. I'm sure you've probably heard 10,000 times, but that doesn't reassure you. So I find that actually getting success is the best way to start building confidence. And you get success by simplifying things to the level where the student, whether that's an adult or a kid, can understand it. You've got to start at the level of the learner. And often with kids with dyscalculia or, even just dyslexia and maths, that means going right back to the start. And, before we were talking about starting with what are numbers and how do they work and, those kind of fundamental understandings. If you don't have those, then it's very unlikely that you're going to get success with something like fractions, which relies on a huge amount of background knowledge for it to make sense. And so I find that it doesn't take much for students to start feeling like this is possible when they start succeeding. And so, and sometimes it's hard for them, but, there have been many occasions where kids have said, I'm never going to be able to do this. And we'll do something and they'll go, well, that was too easy. And I go, well, actually, you know what? Learning doesn't actually have to be hard. You can learn stuff, and if you're learning at your pace, it can always feel easy. And you're learning. And so sometimes I think because learning is so difficult, particularly kind of traditional learning, I think kids often get into that space of like, unless it's really hard, and then I overcome it, I'm not learning anything. Whereas I try and, at least initially, while I'm building resilience and trying to change that mindset to something positive, I deliberately make it such small, fine-grained steps that it doesn't really feel like anything difficult has come along, because you're just building little bit by little bit. And a lot of that is just practice. So, for example, even when I work with adults, there are some basic things that make maths much easier. So if we think about, just building up the concept slowly, bit by bit, well, then there are some skills that make maths easier to do in your head. There are skills and strategies that people who are good at maths just naturally do them. But people who find maths difficult really need those kind of strategies explained to them. So one of them is called number bonds. And so I start off with number bonds to 5, which is just what numbers add up to 5. So it's 5 and 0, 4 and 1, 3 and 2, 2 and 3, 1 and 4, 0 and 5. And so we practice those until they're just automatic. And we practice them by playing lots of games and, a whole variety of things, so that those kind of things just become automatic. And we do the same with number bonds to 10, so 5 and 5, 6 and 4, 7 and 3, 8 and 2, and build those as automatic. I work with kids on counting in 2s. Sometimes with kids, we just start with counting in 1s. Just counting up to 10 and back can be a challenge, but we just practice it and practice it and practice it. And they feel the success. So even if we're talking about something like, and this is, very recent for me with a kid I'm working with, he was thrilled because he could count to 10 and back. And he realized now that, because he loves Thunderbirds, he realized he could do the countdown now, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, like for the blast off. And that feels small, but for him, that's a really big win. And so things like that build confidence. And so then I explain, well, you know what? All of the rest of maths is no more difficult than that. It's just a new thing that you have to learn, and you practice it enough and you do it in small enough steps. And it doesn't feel like it's this insurmountable thing. Whereas if you have, very little background knowledge, or there's some gaps in your knowledge, and then I try and teach you fractions, no matter what I do, it's going to be confusing for you if you can't reliably count. You know what I mean? Because or you can't kind of work out those really basic facts. And fractions rely a lot on multiplication and division. And so if you don't have those basic facts, then I'd be actually taking a step back from fractions and going, well, it's these basic skills we need to build first. It's like fluency. It's kind of like the alphabet of maths. We do counting in 2s. So starting at 0 to 20 and back, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, up to 20 and back. And we also do that same thing starting at 1s. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and backwards, which is really tricky for some kids.
You see
and for
my
quite
face.
Yeah, that's right.
I feel a bit of trauma coming in then when you said backwards.
Yeah.
I don't actually think I probably could, but it would take me time. I wouldn't be able
That's
to do
right.
it automatically.
Yes, correct.
And I probably wouldn't get it right the first few times.
That's right. But think of how many times you've got to do that when you're doing maths. You've got to count forwards and backwards all the time, and you're not always going to be lucky enough to be counting back from a even number. It might be 21 take 3 or 21 take 2. If you've got to stop and go 21, 20, 19, do it on your fingers, then you've kind of lost the thread of the sum that you're working on, because you've kind of had to step out of it to do that small calculation.
Yeah.
But if you build up those fundamental skills so that they just become automatic, it frees up so much of your brain power to then be focusing more on, keeping track of the problem that you're working on, or, whatever it is you're working on. But it also builds confidence. And so once you know you can do it, then you have the confidence. And for kids that struggle, I just let them read it to start with. So they have cards, when we do a new thing like counting in twos, forwards and backwards, I'll make a little card for them, and they practice those cards as often as they can, and we practice them in every session. And if they're struggling with it, I don't put them under pressure, because that's going to make their working memory go out the window, and then, you can see that whole spiral. It doesn't take very much for a kid to be suddenly saying, oh, I'm so dumb, why can't I remember this? And so I kind of have to be on guard and know the kid as well. And just, say for the first 5 weeks, they just might be reading that forwards and backwards and not trying to do it off by heart. And where I might stop, where I might swap over to them doing it, is usually them. It's usually them that says, okay, I want to try this without the card. And I think, this is gold. This is jackpot, because now they're actually challenging themselves, which says to me, their confidence is up. They're not going to feel humiliated or stupid if they get it wrong. So they're kind of building up that little bit of resilience. And so I think just doing that in a really gentle, patient, caring way, not rushing them, letting them know that I understand how hard it is, that there are plenty of other kids that struggle as well. So it's always just, for me, about de-escalating the situation, making it feel achievable, making it feel like, that it's not a pass or fail situation. It isn't right or wrong. It's just a matter of practice and building up skills. I often say, think of kids play sport. I think, if you're playing basketball, you don't just go straight into a game and you're really good at it. You've got to spend hours and hours shooting hoops. And then when you get into a game, you're still going to miss them. It's like that. You just got to do the practice. And once you have the practice, then it frees up all that brain power to be then focusing on what the actual maths problem is, rather than just getting stuck in that calculation. And, I often see kids counting on their fingers and hiding their hands. And I say, you counting on your fingers? And they say, oh, no, I'm not. Because at school they get into trouble. If the teachers say, oh, don't count on your fingers. And so they've got no other strategy. So they kind of put their arms under their hands under their arms, or sit on their hands and try and count with their fingers. But I say, hey, whatever works. Like, if you're using your fingers, bring them out. Let's talk about it. Let's start using them, because eventually you won't need to use them anymore. But it's okay to use those as a step in between. So I think it's just, this is a big, long answer, but I think your question about how do you change attitudes and build confidence, I really don't think just talk can do it. They've got to actually feel success. They've got to actually go, you know what? I didn't understand fractions at the start of this year, and now I do. And once a kid has experienced that, then I think it opens up so many more possibilities. Then they become much more open to tackle things, because they've felt that success.
There's so many things going on in my head. One is the trauma of not letting someone use their fingers, because we use calculators and spreadsheets. So what's the difference? 2, I feel really sad because, again, I think last time I said I wish I had you as my maths teacher, because it makes so much more sense. And I was also thinking it's okay for me to say I'm not that great at maths, because I actually am not, and it shouldn't be, because I was talking to my sister, she's like, you can't have that type of mindset. But actually it makes sense I would have that type of mindset, because I actually have always struggled with it. And so maybe I need to be a bit kinder to myself and say that's okay, because you've got strategies and people to help you. Yeah, so yes. I just learned a lot in that last couple of minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that label's tricky, isn't it? And the negative association with it. And if we think about dyslexia, it's the same, isn't it? It's that's full of shame, isn't it? It's full of like, you may as well be saying I'm no good. You know what I mean? But it's more like, actually, I just find this really difficult. But it doesn't mean you can't learn it. So, it does take time though. So I've been working with an adult for a couple of years now. And she really struggles with maths. You know, she lives with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and maths has never made sense. And so there isn't really a shortcut. You know, you just have to think, okay, this is going to take time, because you really do have to go right back to the basics. And it's kind of like learning the alphabet. You know, if you don't know the alphabet, then it's going to be hard to learn to read a novel without going back to those previous steps. So I really see it as building that scaffolding of those basic facts. And one of the things that I think there's an advantage with in maths that I tell kids about is that maths is a very cyclical subject. So you pretty much do the same thing every year in maths. It's just a bit harder and a bit more complicated. Mm. And that's not the same with literacy and reading. You know, you don't kind of circle back on those things. You know, we just assume you know how to read and spell and we move on. Whereas with maths, you know, you do fractions each year, you do multiplication, you do division, it just gets more complicated. So I explain to kids that you can actually catch up quite quickly in maths, because if there's a hole in your knowledge and we kind of catch you up on that, well, you're going to be doing it again this year in maths. And so you kind of get another chance at it. And if we can get them up to speed, ready for the next level, then they can pretty quickly catch up with their peers, compared to literacy, which is a little bit more tricky as far as the catching up goes, because you kind of don't get much reading instruction after year 4, year 5, do you? It's kind of assumed that you know how to read. Yeah, whereas maths, you still do keep getting instruction all the time about, well, this is the next thing. There are a lot of assumptions in there, but if you can fill those gaps, kids can catch up.
Yeah, because I remember in year 9, they just said sit at the back of the class, and I was compliant and quiet, so I didn't make any trouble. And I just sat at the back of the class because I couldn't, because I didn't have those foundations, like you say. And yeah, but it makes sense that you are building each year, and you can see it as well. Like as you were talking, I can actually see my books from year 7, 8, year 9 as I was going through maths. Still trauma, but I can visualize it in a more positive way as you talk. But it is, and so when you're talking about your adult clients, like it does take so much practice, whether it is reading and writing, which is why we don't do a lot of literacy intervention, because most of the time adults don't have that time and capacity, which is why we're showing lots of different tools to help them if they can't read to the level that they'd like to be able to. So do you find that with maths as well? Because like you said, you've seen this client for a number of years now, that you really have to put in so much effort all the time, or is it because you're building, it's not as much practice? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Because, you know, even though our neuroplasticity changes, it gets harder as you get older.
Yes. I think that there is no easy solution other than hard work. But the hard work doesn't have to be traumatic or stressful or full of anxiety. It can be enjoyable because you can feel like you're making success, getting success. And if you make it so it's not a huge stretch, then it's doable. You know, I don't want to make it so that someone's dreading doing it because it's too hard. And so it's about having the patience to make those small incremental steps. But it is really important to keep it up. And so, you know, even speaking about adults or kids, you know, we've just had the summer holidays and the kids come back in and it's as if I have never worked with them before. So, you know, I had a student yesterday and this was the first maths session we'd had since December last year. And she, is in year 9 now. And she had forgotten how to count. Like she was just really, really struggling because her brain had just gone into like a different mode, you know what I mean? And none of that practice had happened. And so you can, if it's not something that's really, and I suppose this applies for adults, as in, you know, you don't have it learnt when you're young. So those neural pathways are not as strong when you're old, simply because of time. You know, if you learn something when you're 6 years old or 7 years old and now you're 47, well, you've had 40 years of reinforcing those pathways, haven't you? But, you know, if you're 47 and you've only had a year, and not only is it a new pathway, but you're kind of having to get rid of old habits as well. You know what I mean? It's a lot more difficult, but the mechanism's still the same. And so I think it is about practice. And I really try and encourage the kids to practice every day. Some of them do, some of them don't, you know, and adults as well. But I really understand that sometimes it's just too hard. And so that's fine as well. You know what I mean? Like, you have to listen to yourself, because you can over practice and then kind of burn yourself out. And so I think just being patient with yourself, having a plan, going step by step. So if you're an adult that really struggles with maths, you could even just start doing some simple maths. You know, even those exercises that I was talking about before of counting forwards and backwards, they're really fundamental skills, aren't they? And so we also have skip counting, you know, counting in 5, 10, 15, 20, doing that backwards. Another common one we do is counting in tens, starting at a random number that I give them. So I say, okay, count in tens to 100 and back, starting at 3. So they've got to go 3, 13, 23, 33, 43, 53, up to 103, and then backwards. That's hard, isn't it? That's really hard.
My face says it all.
Yeah. But
you lost me after 13, I think. Did you say 13?
That's right. Yeah. And that transition's always really hard, from 3 to 13 to 23. And, you know, kids will often say, especially going backwards, they'll often be 23, and then it will be, I can't remember what they say now, but, you know, it's like 23 or something like that. You know, they just get it all mixed up when you go from those teens to the 20s and 30s. But so that's a really basic skill, isn't it? Being able to count in tens like that. And a really important skill, because you have to do that all the time in maths. And so if you're struggling with, you know, adding 10 to 43 and having to stop and think, 53, if you haven't got that pattern automatic, then it just makes it so much harder. And so, you know, we might move from counting in tens to then one of the initial strategies that we talk about, mental math strategies that we work on and practice, is close to 10. And so let's say we're doing 55 plus 9. Well, you could go 55 plus 9, that's hard, but 55 plus 10 is 65. And then I just take away 1, so that's 64. So little strategies like that I specifically teach kids. You know, another one is doubles or near doubles. So we learn doubles. So if double 8 is 16, then 8 plus 7 is just 1 less, 15. And so that's a little bit more of a tricky one, but learning strategies like that, and when to choose the right strategy for that mental maths, it feels very artificial and difficult to begin with, like almost impossible. But with practice, they find themselves getting it. And as I've said before, that success breeds confidence, which breeds success. And, you know, we try and get over that hump of that anxiety that reduces the working memory. And then, you know, once that's gone, then maths becomes impossible, doesn't it? If you're in a state of panic.
And I was interested when you were saying pattern recognition, because I'm not very good at pattern recognition, which a lot of dyslexics are supposed to be. And so that was, so I wonder if that had been explained to me when I was younger about trying to look at the patterns, whether then I might have been able to build that skill, because it makes logical sense to me, thinking of a pattern, but I'm not good at recognizing it's a pattern until you started explaining it. So, I
Yeah.
mean, that made, when you explained, it's like, oh, if I'd known that, there's a pattern to it, then maybe it would have stuck in my head better. But, as you can see in my face, every time you start going off on different and different maths that I can't keep up. And my husband always says to me, "You just don't get that bit, do you?" And I just said, "No, I don't get that bit." But
No, because you just need to practice it.
yeah, and it's when, like how you said before, once you take it out of the context of the flow, because you've got to actually use your fingers, then it throws everything else out, which makes a lot of sense as well. So I feel like there is a lot more we need to be doing around dyscalculia. And I wonder, are there any, like, I guess as you were talking, like, it's quite expensive, isn't it, if you're going to your tutor every week? And then if you've got speech pathologists or OTs or other things. So are there things that you can suggest people do alongside that can help? Because we know finances can be a barrier for people. Like, sometimes adults talk to me, sometimes they say, have you ever looked at Reading Eggs? It's based on for children, but it's got some of those building blocks that might help. Are there resources or tools that people can do alongside you or other tutors that can help them
Yeah. Well,
to reduce
I'll
that
tell you what,
financial load?
yes. And so my journey was like this. And so I'm not good at maths. And I mean, I'm okay at it. I don't think I live with dyscalculia, but I'm not great at it, probably because of dyslexia and working memory and all that sort of stuff. But, I kind of scraped through at school. And so when I started tutoring, the first thing I was desperately looking for was a sequence. Like, I want a sequence. Like, where do I start and where do we go? Like, how do we do that each week? That was very difficult to find. And so I think there are a couple of books that gave me really good ideas about those sequences. One of them was the Dyscalculia Toolkit by Ronit Bird, which takes you on a sequential step-by-step, journey of here's where you can start. And it's full of activities and so on. And when you buy the physical book, you get a code, and she has lots of really helpful videos as well. And I found those way more helpful than the book because you could actually see what she meant. So that was when I started tutoring. But before I started tutoring, the thing that really helped me the most was a series of videos by Stephen Chin. So he's really well known in the UK for maths and dyslexia. And I believe that he now runs like an accreditation course in the UK, like a dyscalculia qualification, like an intensive course. But he has a set of videos called Maths Explained. And for me, you know how before you were saying, that's making sense to me now when you explain it like that? Most of what I said, I think I've probably got from his videos, because I remember sitting through them and going, why didn't anyone ever tell me this? Like, is that what it is? Is that all it is? And so, yeah, he's got a whole bunch of videos called Maths Explained. They're not very expensive. I think I'm going to get this wrong. I would have to look it up, but you can put a link. But, it's probably like only $150 or something, like a one-off purchase, or you can purchase per topic. And he just goes through maths from the beginning to the end. What is addition? What is subtraction? What is counting? And he does it with PowerPoints and just a really good, simple explanation of everything as he goes through. It's not rushed. And the good thing about them being videos is if you're not sure about it, you can go back and watch it again. So even now, occasionally, I find myself going back and reviewing some of them going, how did he explain that again? Because he's so experienced and so good. His explanations are great. So, I mean, that would be a simple place to start. And for me, that was me as an adult using that when I started tutoring. And it really helped me just get my bearings of, what is the structure here? Where do I start? What's the sequence? So he has a really good sequence. He's got excellent books that he's written as well. So I think you could probably start there with Stephen Chin, because nothing that he does is, at all controversial or difficult or, is going to lead you astray. He's just a really experienced teacher, and he just, slowly takes you through maths.
Not like dyslexia,
at
where there's
the
all
kind of
these
introductory
debates and
level.
arguments.
I mean, you learn much better when you're physically with somebody, of course.
Yeah.
But, that's not always possible. And as you say, money is always tight. And so those videos of his are excellent. And of course, there's always things on YouTube that you can watch. I do find myself reasonably often watching Eddie Wu's lessons. If I'm having trouble remembering something or understanding it, I go and watch his, and I go, oh, yeah. Or I think, that's a great way to introduce that. Because where I think he's excellent is providing that scaffolding for maths. If you notice when he teaches, he always kind of starts with an origin story. So where what he's talking about fits and why it's called what it's called. And so you can really kind of build up that narrative understanding of maths where you can go, that's what calculus is. It's not actually that complicated. It's just solving this problem. So I think there's lots of resources out there, but knowing where to start, I found very difficult. And so I think those videos by Stephen Chin, Maths Explained, will be a great place to start because they're inexpensive. He has some free ones, where you can check it out and see if you like it or not. And then, as I said, you could buy like a fractions module and just look at fractions if you wanted. But they're not that expensive. And so, just working through from beginning to end, I think is good.
It's interesting you saying where that like the background of something comes from, because it does kind of set it conceptually then, doesn't it? I wonder if they should be doing that with dyslexia. Like because in my doctorate we talk about, the concept of dyslexia came up because of people were saying it was word blindness. Yeah. And so, kind of maybe that's what we need to be doing to try and explain, to reduce some of the back and forth around what it is, to help ground it in some context around, what does decoding actually mean, or orthographics and all these terms that are used to explain our challenges. Sorry, I completely digressed,
so
but I thought that was a really...
Yeah. No, I think narrative is really important. And if you think about human architecture, our brain architecture, we're really story machines, aren't we? We think in narrative. We think in what's the story of my life? How does this fit to this? Or at least I do, that's really strong for me. And when there's just kind of some random fact dangling out there that you've got to somehow remember, and there's not a place for it to sit, or there's not like a link for it, then they become very difficult to remember, those random facts. Learning times tables is hard because they're just random facts. You kind of get them into your head just by that brute force of repetition. Yeah. But if you can build a story around it, then I think you have more ways to remember it. You have more ways in. And that's something I do with literacy. When I teach kids to read, I pretty much teach them the history of English as well, because then English makes so much more sense. And it's so much easier to remember how something is spelt, for example, if you remember the story behind why it's got that weird spelling, or even just the general kind of history.
I still get I before E, except after E confused. And I say it to myself over and over and still get it back to front. But yes, maybe if I had context as to why it's I before E, except after C, if they could explain to me why it's except after C, then maybe it would have stuck in my head. This is why I don't teach literacy.
Yeah. Well, so much of it is because English is a mishmash of different languages. I've got a chart on my wall there. You can probably see it. Yeah, so this sits on my wall, and we're looking at this all the time because you can see that English, which kind of comes from Germanic, Old English is like a Germanic language. it's only 20% of our language is actually English. And so that's amazing. And 29% is French, 29% is Latin, 6% is Greek, and then another 6% is unknown where these words came from.
Oh my God,
so,
I've never known this.
Yeah. And so when you say that, and that's what kids say. And that's what I said when I first discovered. I thought, why doesn't anyone ever told me this? Because here am I looking for solid rules and patterns in English, but they don't exist because it's not actually English, really. You know, we borrow words all the time, every day. And so we've got rules and patterns from other languages. And then unfortunately, along the way, people have tried to fix it. And so, people have gone, oh, this is no good. We're going to make this rule. And now, and that actually sounds logical. It makes it even harder then, because now you've got these rules that don't seem to make sense, and a whole bunch of new words come in from another language and they don't fit that rule. So it's really tricky. And so I think knowing that and hearing the stories behind these difficult words, I do a lot of work with morphology with students, which is, the smallest unit of meaning in a word is a morpheme. And there's a whole bunch of roots, they're called, where they're kind of the kernel of meaning in a word. And often they're not even words that live on their own, like ject. Ject is an English root and it means to throw. And so that's why we get eject. So eject, E is out, so to throw out or to force out. And we have adjective, which is to kind of throw meaning at a noun, objective. And so teaching these word parts to kids, first, they get that boost of confidence because now often they know something that their teacher doesn't. They tell their parents about it and so on, and they start spotting it in words. Gives them that boost of confidence, but also because that's how English works, it suddenly doesn't seem so overwhelmingly impossible because there is actually structure to it. English is completely predictable and structured. It's just that it's an incredibly complicated structure that takes time to learn. But if you introduce it tiny bit by tiny bit, as we do new letter combinations, like, why have we got C and K that both make the K sound in English? See? Because it comes from French. And then we had the K that wasn't from French. And so now we have this problem in English of like, what do we do? Because now we've got two letters for the same sound. And then we've got CK that's making K as well. So that's all quite complicated. But when I introduce it, I talk to it. I talk like that about how would you solve this problem? If you were the person in charge of the language. So I think getting kids to have that kind of meta awareness, and I don't know, I think of it as a narrative underpinning to literacy and understanding, not just maths, but literacy and in particular spelling. I think when you have those strategies, you don't feel so helpless. So we have smart spelling as one of the things we teach, which is a strategy for spelling tricky words. And so, I won't go into it now, but you can explicitly teach a strategy and kids can practice it. So when they come up with a tricky word, they're not just lost. They can go, I can try this, I can try this, I can try this, I can try this. And even if it doesn't work, it's still kind of empowering to have, a strategy for it, isn't it? Yeah. So I think it is complicated, but I have that same approach. I know we've gone off on a tangent here, but that same kind of approach of structure, and really this is what people are talking about when they talk about scaffolding. So having that conceptual scaffolding for what you're doing is really important. And, for maths, for me, that comes down to being able to physically represent what's happening in maths. For people living with dyscalculia, they need to link those conceptual squiggly figures to actual physical examples. You know, when we do volume and measurement, you know, I'm getting out water and we're weighing it and measuring it. And so it's sometimes a bit like a science lab, if you know what I mean. But I think those kind of experiences help you anchor the concepts rather than it just all being conceptual words on a page, particularly if you live with dyslexia as well. You know, it's so disconnected even from where that maths came from. You know, because when that maths was invented, it was to solve a physical real world problem. Even the complex maths we have today is about, you know, how do we get a GPS satellite to work? It's still kind of solving a real world problem, isn't it? And so I think, you know, I
was going to say, still don't understand how sound waves create the TV. And I still say to Daniel, I know it happens, but I just don't understand how it actually works. It always baffles me because there's maths behind it.
Yeah, there's maths. And you know, we often separate maths out, don't we? I think it's a little bit of a pity that maths is isolated from science, because so much of science is maths and so much of maths is science. And I think, you know, as a former science teacher, in my mind, they're not separate subjects. You know what I mean? Like maths is kind of a skill you need for science and vice versa. And so, you know, I think having that hands-on experiential approach to maths is helpful, because kids get much more engaged with it as well. You know, like I've got a big tub of rice when we're doing fractions, and, you know, they've got to work out equal fractions by saying, you know, how many half cups can you fit in a whole cup? And you know what I mean? So those kind of experiences that make it more meaningful rather than just squiggles on a page. Yeah, pizzas.
Well, I would love to have you come on the show to talk about dysgraphia next.
Yes, sure. Yep.
So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure.
Is there any last words you'd like to say before we jump off?
I think I've loved this last little conversation we've had about the whole mental health aspect of it, of how do you be positive. And so I think if you are someone out there either living with a learning difficulty yourself, or you've got a child or someone you support, it is possible to do it. You know, if you get the right support, or even if you're supporting yourself, by taking it little bit by little bit and getting those bits of success, you're not doomed to always be bad at maths or to always be bad at reading. And so I think that's the takeaway, is that just because school didn't work for you doesn't mean you can't learn it. It just means that it probably just needs to go at a slower pace and more fine-grained. So I think positive. I think it's good to be positive about it, because I think too many people end up thinking I'm dumb or I can't do it or whatever because of their school experience. But it's not true. You know, you can learn it. You know, it takes time and effort, but you can do it.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.